Hey there, travelers. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from. Now let's begin our journey into the unknown. I'd been reviewing containment protocols for the third time that week when Director Toddler's voice shattered the routine calm that had defined my last years with the agency. Crews, we have a code black in Sector 7. Train derailment, classified cargo compromised. You leave in 10 minutes. My coffee went cold in my hand. Code black meant something had escaped containment. In 15 years, I'd responded to exactly 3 code blacks, and each one had changed me in ways I still couldn't fully articulate. This time felt different before I even stood up from my desk. The storm raging outside Topeka had been building for hours, turning the Kansas plains into a battlefield of wind and rain that seemed determined to wash away everything in its path. Team assignment? I asked, already reaching for my gear bag. Chatwin, Farrier, and Harbor. Standard Anomaly response, but crews... Toddler's pause stretched longer than protocol allowed. Orders are different this time. No capture, no containment. Neutralize on site. The words hit me wrong. Department 47 existed to study anomalies, to understand them, to contain them when necessary. Neutralization was reserved for threats so extreme that containment posed an existential risk to civilian populations. In 15 years, I'd received kill orders exactly twice, and both times the entities in question had been actively consuming entire city blocks. 20 minutes later, our black SUV cut through sheets of rain on Highway 70, heading toward coordinates that placed us 40 miles from the nearest town. Robbie Chatwin sat in the passenger seat, checking his demolition equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 2 tours defusing IEDs in Afghanistan. His weathered hands moved over each component with practiced familiarity, but I caught him glancing at the storm with uncharacteristic nervousness. "Never seen weather this bad in Kansas," he muttered, watching lightning split the sky in jagged patterns that seemed to follow unnatural geometries. "Feels wrong somehow." Harlan Farrier hunched over his communications array in the back seat, trying to establish contact with the crash site. At 26, he was the youngest member of our unit, brilliant with electronics, but still naive about what we sometimes faced in the field. His equipment kept producing static bursts that sounded almost like voices speaking in languages that didn't exist. "Getting weird interference," Harlan reported, adjusting frequencies with increasing frustration. "Signals bouncing off something that shouldn't be there. Atmospheric disturbance doesn't explain this pattern." Dr. Rick Harbour sat beside him, reviewing classified files on his tablet with the intense focus that had made him Department 47's leading field analyst. His doctorate in xenobiology from MIT meant nothing to the creatures we encountered, but his ability to recognize patterns in anomalous behavior had saved our lives more than once. Tonight, his usual confidence seemed strained as he scrolled through documents I wasn't cleared to read. "The cargo manifest is heavily redacted," Harbour said without looking up. 3 containers, origin unknown, destination classified beyond my clearance level. Whatever was being transported, someone very important wanted it moved very quietly. The crash site appeared through the storm, as a constellation of emergency flares scattered across a quarter-mile of twisted steel and splintered wood. The freight train had been traveling eastbound when it derailed, sending 47 cars careening off the tracks in a chain reaction that turned cargo containers into metallic confetti. Emergency responders had established a perimeter, but something about their positioning troubled me immediately. "They're staying too far back," Robbie observed, studying the scene through binoculars. "EMTs aren't approaching the wreckage. That's not standard protocol for a train crash." I radioed the incident commander, a Kansas State Police captain named Freeman, who'd been coordinating with federal agencies since the derailment occurred 3 hours earlier. His voice carried the strain of someone who'd seen something he couldn't explain and wasn't sure he wanted to. "Department 47, this is Captain Freeman. We've secured the perimeter per your agency's instructions, but I need to warn you. We found bodies near the cargo cars. Something's not right about how they died." We approached the wreckage on foot, our tactical lights cutting through rain that fell in sheets so thick it seemed solid. The storm had turned the crash site into a swamp of mud and debris that sucked at our boots with every step. Emergency flares cast everything in hellish red light that made shadows dance and writhe among the twisted metal. The first body lay 50 yards from the main wreckage, and I knew immediately why the emergency responders had retreated. The man's skull had been crushed with surgical precision. The bone cracked in a perfect circle around the crown, as if something had gripped his head and applied pressure until it gave way. Brain matter had been extracted completely, leaving only an empty cavity that gleamed wetly in our flashlight beams. "Jesus Christ," Harlan whispered, covering his mouth with his sleeve. "What could do that?" Harbour knelt beside the corpse, studying the wound patterns with clinical detachment that impressed and disturbed me in equal measure. His gloved hands traced the fracture lines while I fought the urge to drag him away from the grotesque scene. "The crushing pattern suggests immense jaw strength, but the extraction technique indicates intelligence," he reported. "Whatever did this understood anatomy well enough to access the brain without damaging surrounding tissue unnecessarily. This wasn't random predation. This was methodical." We found 2 more bodies as we moved deeper into the wreckage, each displaying identical trauma. The victims appeared to be railroad workers who'd been inspecting the cargo when something escaped containment. Their faces were frozen in expressions of pure terror, suggesting they'd had time to see what was killing them before their skulls were cracked open like eggs. The source of their terror became clear when we reached the cargo cars. 3 specialized containers had been breached from the inside, their reinforced steel walls torn apart with forces that shouldn't have been possible. The metal edges were peeled back in spirals that hurt to look at directly, and a substance that wasn't quite blood coated everything in sticky, dark streaks. "The containers were built to contain something specific," Robbie said, running his hands over locks that had been snapped like twigs. "Military-grade restraints, biometric sensors, internal atmosphere controls. This wasn't standard freight." Harlan's equipment suddenly erupted in a cacophony of electronic screams that made us all jump. He frantically adjusted settings, trying to isolate the source of the interference, when his face went pale with recognition. "Movement signatures," he reported, his voice barely audible over the storm. 3 distinct heat sources, approximately human-sized, moving away from the crash site in coordinated patterns. They're heading northwest, toward... He consulted his GPS device with hands that shook slightly. "Toward inhabited areas." The tracking led us across 2 miles of muddy farmland that had been turned into a lake by the storm. Our boots splashed through standing water that reflected lightning in brief, strobing moments of clarity before plunging us back into darkness that seemed to press against our flashlight beams. The creature's trail was easy to follow once we knew what to look for. Deep footprints that showed elongated proportions, claw marks in fence posts, and that same dark substance smeared on anything they'd touched. We found them in an abandoned barn that had been slowly collapsing for decades. The structure leaned at dangerous angles, its roof partially caved in and walls warped by years of Kansas weather. But it provided shelter from the storm, and more importantly, it was far enough from the main farmhouse that screams wouldn't carry. The smell hit us first. Copper and decay mixed with something organic that made my stomach clench with primal revulsion. Harbour identified it immediately as the scent of predators who'd been feeding recently. A musk that triggered every evolutionary instinct humans possessed for recognizing apex hunters. Robbie took point as we entered the barn, his rifle raised and safety off. The interior was a maze of rotting hay bales and rusted farm equipment that created countless hiding spots for something that didn't want to be found. Our tactical lights swept across cobwebs thick as curtains and dust motes that danced in the air like ash from some distant fire. The sounds came from the basement, wet, rhythmic crunching that made my teeth ache with sympathetic resonance. Something was eating down there, taking its time with a meal that was still warm. The basement access was a wooden trapdoor that hung open, revealing stairs that descended into absolute darkness. "Radio for backup," I whispered to Harlan, but his equipment produced only static that sounded like screaming voices. "No signal," he reported. "Whatever's down there is interfering with everything electronic." We descended into darkness that felt alive, our flashlight beams seeming to bend and twist as they penetrated the basement's depths. The air grew thick with humidity and that predator musk, making each breath feel like swallowing syrup. The crunching sounds grew louder with every step, accompanied by satisfied breathing that definitely wasn't human. At the bottom of the stairs, our lights revealed a scene that would haunt me for the rest of my life. 3 creatures crouched in the basement's center, hunched over something that had once been a person. They were humanoid but wrong in every proportion. 7 feet tall with limbs stretched to impossible lengths, joints that bent in directions that violated basic anatomy, and skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their faces were the worst part. Human features distorted beyond recognition, with jaws that unhinged to reveal rows of teeth designed for crushing bone. A single eye dominated each face, large as a dinner plate and glowing with intelligence that was unmistakably aware of our presence. But it was the sounds they made while feeding that broke something inside me. In the complete darkness, I could hear everything with crystal clarity. The methodical grinding of powerful jaws working through skull bone, the wet suction as brain matter was extracted, the satisfied huffing between bites. Warm droplets spattered my face in the darkness, and the metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with decay filled my nostrils until I could taste copper on my tongue. One creature looked up from its meal, brain matter dripping from its massive jaws as that single eye fixed on our group with predatory calculation. The intelligence in its gaze was unmistakable. This wasn't some mindless beast. It understood exactly what we represented, and was deciding whether we posed a threat worth interrupting its feeding to address. The other two continued eating, their powerful jaws crushing through bone with sounds that echoed off the basement walls in rhythmic patterns that seemed almost musical in their horrible precision. I realized with dawning horror that they were sharing their meal, taking turns with the efficiency of a pack that had hunted together for a very long time. When our flashlights hit them directly, all three creatures recoiled with hisses that sounded like steam escaping from damaged pipes. They scrambled away from our lights, moving with fluid grace that defied their impossible anatomy, and vanished into shadows that seemed deeper than our beams could penetrate. That's when I understood why we'd been given kill orders instead of containment protocols. These weren't just anomalies to be studied. They were apex predators with human-level intelligence and capabilities that made conventional containment impossible. And we were about to learn just how impossible when one of them decided our lights were too much of a threat to ignore. The creature closest to us moved first, abandoning its meal with a wet snarl that echoed through the basement's confines. Its impossible anatomy unfolded as it rose to full height, joints extending in ways that defied every law of human physiology. The single massive eye fixed on Robbie's rifle with predatory focus, recognizing the weapon as a threat to be eliminated. "Light discipline," I barked, but it was too late. Our tactical beams had already triggered their flight response, and three apex predators with human-level intelligence were now cornered in a confined space with nowhere to retreat. The first creature launched itself at Robbie with speed that rendered our training useless. Its elongated limbs propelled it across the basement in a single bound, covering 15 feet of distance before gravity should have allowed. Robbie managed one shot, a burst from his assault rifle that punched through the creature's torso without slowing its advance, before those massive jaws clamped down on his skull. The sound of Robbie's head being crushed was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not the quick crack of breaking bone, but a slow, methodical grinding as the creature's jaw pressure increased incrementally. Robbie's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the wet suction sounds of brain matter being extracted with surgical precision. His body convulsed once, then went limp in the creature's grasp. "Move! Move! Move!" I shouted, opening fire on the creature still feeding on Robbie. My bullets struck center mass, punching through flesh that leaked that same dark substance we'd found at the crash site. The creature released Robbie's corpse and turned toward me with annoyance rather than pain, as if my rifle fire was merely an inconvenience. Harlan's electronics went completely haywire, sparking and smoking as electromagnetic interference from the creatures overloaded every circuit. He dropped his equipment and drew his sidearm, but his hands shook so violently that his first shots went wide, striking the basement walls and sending fragments of old stone ricocheting through the confined space. The second creature moved to flank us, displaying tactical awareness that chilled me to the bone. These weren't mindless beasts acting on instinct. They were coordinating their attack with the efficiency of a special forces unit. Its single eye tracked our movements while it maneuvered to cut off our escape route to the stairs. Dr. Harbour had pressed himself against the basement wall, his scientific mind apparently struggling to process what he was witnessing. "The bullet wounds," he said with clinical detachment that seemed completely inappropriate given our circumstances. "They're not bleeding properly. The tissue is sealing itself almost immediately." The third creature rose from its interrupted meal with deliberate slowness, brain matter still dripping from its massive jaws. This one was different, larger than the others, with scars across its elongated torso that suggested it had survived encounters with armed opponents before. When it looked at me, I saw calculation in that dinner plate-sized eye, and intelligence evaluating our weapons and tactics with predatory patience. I switched to full automatic, emptying my magazine into the closest creature's center mass. The impact staggered it backward, dark fluid spurting from multiple wound channels, but it remained upright and focused. The bullet seemed to pass through its tissue without hitting anything vital, as if its anatomy was arranged differently than human physiology would suggest. Harlan managed to put 3 rounds into the flanking creature's torso before it reached him. His bullets had the same minimal effect. The creature absorbed the damage without losing momentum and backhanded him with casual force that sent him flying across the basement. He struck the stone wall with a wet crack that told me his spine was broken before his body hit the ground. The largest creature moved toward Harlan's prone form with predatory grace, its massive jaws already beginning to unhinge in preparation for feeding. Harlan was still conscious, his eyes wide with terror as he realized what was about to happen. He tried to crawl away, but his shattered spine left his legs useless. "Please," Harlan whispered, looking directly at me. "Don't let it—" The creature's jaws closed around his skull with the same methodical precision I'd witnessed with Robbie. The grinding sound of bone being crushed seemed to last forever, echoing off the basement walls in rhythmic patterns that would haunt my dreams. Harlan's body spasmed as his brain was extracted, then went still with the finality of death. That left Dr. Harbour and me facing 3 creatures that had just demonstrated our conventional weapons were essentially useless against them. The tactical situation had collapsed completely. We were trapped in a confined space with predators that possessed superior physical capabilities and intelligence that matched our own. "The stairs," I said to Harbour, reloading with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. "We need elevation advantage." But as we moved toward the basement entrance, the largest creature positioned itself between us and escape. Its single eye tracked our movement with predatory focus, while the other 2 creatures flanked us from opposite sides. They were hurting us, I realized, coordinating their positions to limit our options while they decided how to proceed. That's when Dr. Harbour surprised me. Instead of panicking, his scientific mind apparently kicked into overdrive, analyzing our situation with the same clinical detachment he'd shown while examining the corpses at the crash site. "The light sensitivity," he said suddenly. "They avoided our tactical beams initially. Intense illumination might be our only advantage." I pulled out my emergency flare, the kind designed to burn for 30 minutes with magnesium intensity. The creatures recognized the threat immediately, their coordinated positioning dissolving as they scattered to avoid the brilliant illumination. But the basement offered limited hiding spots, and the flare's light reflected off every surface with blinding intensity. The closest creature tried to reach me before I could ignite the flare, but I managed to strike the ignition cap just as its claws raked across my tactical vest. Magnesium fire erupted between us, and the creature recoiled with a shriek that sounded like metal being torn apart. All 3 creatures pressed themselves against the basement's far wall, their massive eyes squinting shut against the flare's brilliance. They were trapped between their light sensitivity and their desire to eliminate the threat I represented, creating a stalemate that bought us precious seconds to plan an escape. The flare began to sputter, its brilliant light fading to orange, then red. In the dying illumination, I could see all 3 creatures preparing to move, their impossible anatomy coiling with predatory tension. That's when part of the barn's roof collapsed completely, bringing down a section of wall and creating a new opening to the storm outside. Wind and rain poured through the gap, and lightning strobed with intensity that sent the creatures fleeing deeper into the basement's shadows. "Now!" I yelled to Harbour, and we both ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time while thunder crashed overhead. Behind us, I could hear the creatures moving, but the continued lightning strikes seemed to be disrupting their coordination. We reached the barn's main level, just as another section of roof gave way, opening the structure to the full fury of the Kansas storm. Rain poured through multiple gaps, and lightning provided strobing illumination that turned the barn into a nightmare landscape of shadows and blinding light. 2 of the creatures emerged from the basement, moving cautiously as they tested each shadow for adequate cover. But the storm's intensity was working against them, providing too much random illumination for effective concealment. They seemed confused by the constantly changing light conditions, their coordination disrupted by environmental factors they couldn't control. The third creature, the one I'd wounded with my rifle fire, lay motionless at the bottom of the basement stairs. Dark fluid pooled around its body, and that massive eye stared sightlessly at the ceiling. Whatever those bullets had done to its internal anatomy, the damage had finally overcome its regenerative capabilities. One down, Dr. Harbour observed with scientific satisfaction. Two remaining, and they're showing clear behavioral adaptation to environmental stimuli. The surviving creatures had positioned themselves near the barn's main entrance, cutting off our most obvious escape route. But the collapsed roof sections had created multiple openings, and the storm's chaos was masking our movements as effectively as it was disrupting theirs. I made my choice and sprinted for the largest gap in the wall, where a section of timber had fallen outward to create a ramp to ground level. Harbour followed close behind, his academic mind apparently cataloging details even while fleeing for his life. We reached the opening just as lightning illuminated the farmland beyond the barn. 2 miles of muddy field stretched between us and the crash site, where emergency responders waited with vehicles and communications equipment. But as we ran through the storm, splashing through standing water that reflected lightning in brief moments of clarity, I realized the creatures weren't following us toward the crash site. They were heading in the opposite direction, toward inhabited areas, toward Sakentown. "We have to warn them," Harbour shouted over the storm's fury. "Population 847, mostly farming families. They won't stand a chance against predators this intelligent." I tried my radio, but the static that emerged sounded like screaming voices speaking in languages that didn't exist. Whatever electromagnetic interference the creatures generated was still affecting our equipment, even at this distance. "Emergency services," I said, pointing toward the crash site's flashing lights. "We get to Captain Freeman, coordinate an evacuation of Sakentown before those things reach populated areas." But even as we changed course toward the emergency perimeter, I knew we were already too late. The creatures had a significant head start, and their superior physical capabilities meant they could cover ground faster than any human pursuit. By the time we organized a response, they would already be hunting in populated areas. Captain Freeman met us at the perimeter with grim efficiency that suggested he'd been expecting bad news. His state police training had prepared him for coordination with federal agencies, but nothing could have prepared him for what we were about to report. "Department 47, what's your status?" he asked, noting immediately that half our team was missing. "2 KIA, 3 anomalies escaped containment. Heading for Sakentown," I reported with military brevity that felt inadequate to describe what we'd witnessed. "We need immediate evacuation of all civilian populations within a 15-mile radius." Freeman's expression shifted from professional concern to outright disbelief. "Agent Cruz, Sakentown has nearly 900 residents. I can't authorize mass evacuation based on unconfirmed threats. I need more details about what we're dealing with." Dr. Harbour stepped forward, his scientific credentials lending weight to our incredible claims. "Captain, we're dealing with apex predators that demonstrate human-level intelligence, pack coordination, and physical capabilities that render conventional weapons largely ineffective. They feed specifically on human brain matter and show clear preference for hunting during periods of reduced visibility. You're telling me we have 3... what? Monsters loose in my county?" "2 monsters," I corrected. "We eliminated one during our encounter. But the remaining entities have demonstrated tactical adaptation and learning behavior that makes them exponentially more dangerous than standard anomaly classifications." Freeman consulted his watch with the expression of someone calculating response times against probable casualty rates. "Storm's been hitting Sakentown for 2 hours already. If these things are hunting during reduced visibility like you say, they might already be..." He didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood the implications. While we'd been fighting for our lives in that basement, 2 apex predators with human intelligence had been given perfect hunting conditions in a populated area with no warning and no preparation. "Communications," Freeman said, moving toward his command vehicle. "I need contact with Sakentown's emergency services immediately." But the radio produced only static, punctuated by sounds that might have been screaming, might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. The electromagnetic interference was getting stronger, not weaker, suggesting the creatures were actively using their abilities to disrupt our coordination efforts. "Phone lines are down throughout the county," Freeman's communications officer reported. Storm damage to the infrastructure, but the pattern's unusual. Selective outages that don't match typical weather-related failures. Dr. Harbour and I exchanged glances. The creatures weren't just hunting randomly, they were systematically eliminating their prey's ability to call for help or coordinate resistance. The intelligence we'd witnessed in that basement was being applied on a much larger scale. We go in personally, I decided. 2-vehicle convoy, full tactical gear. Assume hostile contact the moment we enter city limits. Freeman nodded grimly. I'll coordinate with County Sheriff's Department, get additional units rolling towards Saken Town from multiple directions. If these things are as dangerous as you say, we'll need overwhelming force and multiple escape routes. 30 minutes later, our convoy cut through the storm towards Saken Town. Emergency lights reflecting off sheets of rain that fell with relentless intensity. Dr. Harbour rode with me, reviewing his notes from our basement encounter, while I focused on driving through conditions that reduced visibility to maybe 50 yards. The feeding behavior suggests specific nutritional requirements, he said, apparently finding comfort in scientific analysis. Brain tissue contains high concentrations of lipids and proteins that might be essential to their metabolism. This isn't random predation. It's targeted hunting for specific biological resources. Does that help us predict their behavior? I asked, fighting to keep our vehicle on the road as wind gusts threatened to push us into roadside ditches. Potentially, if they require regular feeding, they'll seek out areas with high population density rather than scattered rural targets. Saken Town's main residential district would be optimal hunting grounds, concentrated prey with limited escape routes. We crested a hill 3 miles from Saken Town and saw our worst fears confirmed. The town's lights were visible through the storm, but they were scattered and intermittent rather than showing the normal patterns of an inhabited community. Streetlights functioned in some areas while entire neighborhoods remained dark, creating a patchwork of illumination that suggested systematic disruption rather than random storm damage. They're using the infrastructure against the population, Harbour observed. Disabling power to specific areas to create hunting zones with optimal visibility conditions for their purposes. My radio crackled with Freeman's voice from the trailing vehicle. Crews, I'm getting reports from County Dispatch. Multiple 911 calls from Saken Town cut off mid-transmission, all within the last hour. Pattern suggests systematic progression through residential areas. We entered Saken Town's outskirts at 3:17 a.m., finding streets that should have been empty due to the storm but felt empty in a way that raised every instinct I'd developed during 15 years of Anomaly response. No lights in windows, no vehicles moving, no signs of human activity, despite a population that should have numbered in the hundreds. The first house we investigated showed signs of interrupted evening routines. A television flickered with static, casting eerie shadows on walls marked with deep claw marks. Family photographs had been scattered across hardwood floors, and dark stains on the carpet could only be blood. But no bodies, no survivors. Efficient predation, Dr. Harbour noted, examining the scene with scientific detachment that I found both impressive and disturbing. They're not killing randomly. They're taking their prey to a centralized location for feeding, probably to avoid exposure during consumption. Every house told the same story. Families interrupted in the middle of their evening routines, then simply gone. In one home, I found a child's homework spread across the dining room table. Math problems half completed with a pencil lying beside them, as if dropped mid-calculation. Another house showed evidence of struggle, overturned furniture, scattered belongings, gouges in drywall that matched the claw marks we'd found at the crash site. But still no bodies, no survivors, no indication of where the residents had been taken. They're moving the victims somewhere they can feed safely, I realized. Centralized feeding location where they can consume their prey without being exposed to the storm or potential threats. Freeman's voice came through our radios with growing urgency. Crews, we've identified approximately 40 residences showing signs of forced entry. Estimated missing persons approaching 200 individuals. This is beyond Anomaly response. This is mass casualty incident. Dr. Harbour was studying the electromagnetic readings on his backup equipment, devices simple enough to function despite the creature's interference. Signal strength is increasing toward the town's industrial district, he reported. Whatever's generating the electromagnetic anomalies is concentrated in that area. We regrouped at Saken Town's main intersection, our vehicles forming a defensive perimeter, while Freeman coordinated with additional units approaching from surrounding counties. The storm continued to rage overhead, providing cover for whatever the creatures were doing with their harvested prey. Industrial district is primarily textile manufacturing, Freeman reported, consulting local maps. 3 major facilities, all closed for renovation following economic downturns. Plenty of large spaces where they could take shelter. The abandoned Sakan textile mill sat on 12 acres at the town's eastern edge, its red brick buildings rising from the Kansas prairie with industrial solidity that had weathered decades of economic decline. Multiple structures connected by covered walkways created a complex large enough to house whatever operation the creatures had established. As we approached the facility, the electromagnetic interference intensified to levels that disabled our remaining electronics completely. Radios produced only static, vehicle electrical systems began failing, and even our flashlights flickered with unreliable illumination. "They're definitely here," Dr. Harbour confirmed, watching his equipment fail systematically. "Signal strength is off the charts. Whatever they're doing requires enormous electromagnetic manipulation." The factory's main building showed signs of recent occupancy. Doors that should have been secured with chains and padlocks hung open. Their locks snapped with the same casual force we'd witnessed at the train crash. Fresh claw marks scored brick walls, and that familiar dark substance stained everything the creatures had touched. "Perimeter security," Freeman ordered his officers. "Nobody goes in alone. Maintain visual contact at all times. Fall back at first sign of hostile contact." But I knew our conventional tactics were useless against entities that had systematically harvested 200 people in under 4 hours. Whatever we found inside that factory would challenge every assumption we'd made about Anomaly containment. Dr. Harbour and I took point, entering the factory's main floor through loading docks that opened onto vast spaces filled with abandoned textile machinery. Our flashlights revealed production floors designed to handle industrial-scale operations, now repurposed for activities that made my stomach clench with dread. The smell hit us immediately. Copper and decay mixed with that predator musk, but amplified to levels that suggested feeding on a massive scale. Somewhere in this facility, the creatures had established a processing center for their harvested prey. "Second floor," Harbour said, pointing toward sounds that echoed through the building's steel framework. "Rhythmic activity, multiple sources. They're still processing their harvest." We climbed industrial stairs that led to production floors with clear sight lines across the factory's interior. From this elevation, we could see into areas our ground-level reconnaissance had missed, revealing the true scope of what the creatures had accomplished. The factory's central floor had been converted into a temporary shelter where the creatures could feed without exposure to the storm. Victims had been dragged here for consumption, their remains scattered with the casual efficiency of predators who needed shelter while they fed. "They're not just hiding," I whispered, realizing the tactical advantage they'd gained. "They found defensible territory where they can feed safely while the storm provides cover." That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with apex predators seeking shelter. We were facing entities that had found perfect hunting territory, a defensible position with abundant prey and environmental conditions that worked entirely in their favor. And somewhere in this facility, 2 of them were still alive, still feeding, still adapting to this hostile new environment they'd been forced into. Dr. Harbour moved ahead to get better visual confirmation of what we were seeing, his scientific curiosity overriding survival instincts that should have kept him behind our defensive perimeter. He approached the railing overlooking the central feeding area with camera equipment that might function despite the electromagnetic interference. "Rick, stay back," I warned. But he was already leaning over the railing to document evidence of what these creatures had done to Sakentown's population. That's when one of the creatures rose from its feeding position, that massive eye fixing on Dr. Harbour with predatory focus. It had been waiting, using the feeding activity as camouflage while it positioned itself for another hunt. The creature moved with that impossible speed we'd witnessed in the basement, crossing 30 feet of factory floor in a single bound, and launching itself toward the second-floor railing where Harbour stood exposed. He had time to register the threat, time to step backward, but not time to escape. The creature's elongated limbs reached the railing just as Dr. Harbour tried to retreat. Those massive jaws opened with predatory satisfaction, and the last sound Rick Harbour ever made was a scream that echoed through the factory's steel framework before being cut off by the methodical grinding of skull bone being crushed. I was alone with two apex predators in a facility designed for industrial-scale processing, watching the smartest man I'd ever known being consumed while Freeman's officers waited outside, unaware that our reconnaissance had become a feeding opportunity. But this time, I had advantages we'd lacked in the basement. This time, I understood what I was fighting. And this time, I was going to make sure these creatures never hunted again. The sound of Dr. Harbour's skull being crushed echoed through the Sakan textile mill's steel framework, leaving me alone with two apex predators in territory they'd claimed through systematic slaughter. His body tumbled from the second-floor railing to the production floor below, landing with the wet finality of death among the scattered remains of Sakan Town's population. I was the last member of Department 47's response team still breathing, surrounded by industrial machinery that offered concealment but no real protection against creatures that had demonstrated superior physical capabilities and tactical intelligence. The electromagnetic interference they generated had disabled my remaining equipment, leaving me with conventional weapons that had already proven largely ineffective. But something had changed in the creatures' behavior since we'd cornered them in the barn basement. The coordinated pack tactics I'd witnessed earlier were replaced by something that looked almost like grief. The creature that had killed Dr. Harbour didn't immediately move to attack me. Instead, it crouched beside his body, that massive eye staring at the remains with what appeared to be confusion. The second creature emerged from the shadows near the mill's central feeding area, moving with less of the predatory grace I'd observed before. It approached its companion slowly, and when their eyes met, both creatures made sounds I'd never heard from them. Low, keening calls that resonated through the building's metal framework with haunting sadness. They were mourning their dead companion from the barn. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. These weren't just intelligent predators, they were social beings capable of emotional attachment. The coordinated hunting, the pack tactics, the way they'd shared feeding in the basement, they weren't just working together for efficiency, they cared about each other. And now one of them was gone forever. The creature that had killed Dr. Harbour looked up from his body and fixed that dinner plate-sized eye on me. But instead of the predatory calculation I'd seen before, I witnessed something that looked unmistakably like rage mixed with profound loss. It understood that I was responsible for its companion's death, and it wanted revenge. The second creature positioned itself to flank me, but its movements lacked the precise coordination they'd displayed earlier. These weren't tactical maneuvers. They were the desperate actions of grieving beings who'd lost something irreplaceable in hostile territory far from anything familiar. I backed toward the mill's loading area, keeping both creatures in sight while searching for anything that might give me an advantage. The industrial equipment offered limited cover, and the building's exits were too far away to reach before the creatures could intercept me. I was trapped in a facility designed for textile production, facing opponents who'd already demonstrated conventional weapons couldn't stop them. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. I understood what they were feeling. "I'm sorry about your friend," I said, my voice echoing off the mill's metal walls. It felt insane to apologize to creatures that had just consumed nearly 200 people, but the grief in their behavior was unmistakable. They'd lost family. Both creatures froze at the sound of my voice, their massive eyes focusing on me with surprise that seemed almost human. They tilted their heads in that distinctly avian manner, as if trying to process words spoken in a language they couldn't understand, but somehow recognized as communication. The larger creature, the one that had killed Dr. Harbour, took a step forward, its elongated limbs moving with predatory caution. But instead of attacking immediately, it made that same keening sound I'd heard before, a call that seemed to be asking questions I couldn't answer. They were trying to communicate. I raised my hands slowly, showing empty palms while keeping my rifle accessible but non-threatening. Every instinct developed through 15 years of Anomaly response screamed that this was suicide, that showing weakness to apex predators would only accelerate my death. But something in their behavior suggested they were as confused by this situation as I was. "You're not from here," I said, maintaining eye contact with the larger creature. "This isn't your territory. You're lost, aren't you?" The creature's head tilted further, and it made a sound that was almost questioning. The electromagnetic interference it generated seemed to fluctuate with its emotional state. Equipment around the mill sparking more intensely when it appeared agitated, settling to a steady hum when it focused on my voice. The second creature approached from my right flank, but its movement seemed curious rather than aggressive. When it got within 10 feet, it stopped and crouched low, bringing its head down to my eye level. That massive pupil dilated and contracted as it studied my face with scientific precision that reminded me of Dr. Harbour examining anomaly specimens. It was trying to understand what I was. The moment stretched between us. 3 beings from completely different evolutionary paths, meeting in circumstances that should have resulted in immediate violence, but instead created something that felt almost like recognition. They were predators, yes. But they were also lost and grieving creatures, trying to survive in an environment that was as alien to them as they were to us. That's when I made the mistake that nearly cost me my life. I took a step forward, thinking I could somehow establish real communication with entities that possessed intelligence comparable to my own. The larger creature's eye tracked my movement, and I saw the exact moment when curiosity shifted back to predatory instinct. Its massive jaws unhinged with hydraulic precision, revealing rows of teeth designed for crushing bone. The grieving being I'd glimpsed moments before disappeared, replaced by an apex predator that recognized me as a threat to be eliminated. The creature launched itself forward with that impossible speed, crossing 15 feet of distance in a single bound. I managed to get my rifle up and empty the magazine into its torso, watching bullets punch through flesh that leaked dark fluid, but didn't slow its advance. Those elongated limbs reached for my head with claws that could shred steel, and I threw myself sideways behind a massive industrial loom that had been abandoned when the mill closed. The creature's momentum carried it past my position, and its claws raked across the textile machinery with sounds like metal being torn apart. The second creature moved to flank me again, but this time, its approach was purely predatory. Whatever moment of recognition we'd shared was over. They'd reverted to their fundamental nature as hunters who needed to feed. I rolled behind another piece of machinery as the first creature wheeled around for another attack. The mill's production floor became a deadly maze of industrial equipment, metal frameworks, and abandoned textile spools that provided concealment but no real protection against beings that could tear through steel. The creatures began coordinating their attacks again, their grief temporarily set aside in favor of tactical efficiency. One would drive me from cover while the other positioned itself to intercept my escape route. They were herding me toward the mill's central area where they could attack from multiple angles simultaneously. I had maybe 30 seconds before their tactics forced me into the open. That's when I remembered the mill's industrial lighting system. The building had been designed for precision textile work, requiring illumination systems that could provide uniform brightness across vast production areas. Banks of high-intensity fluorescent fixtures hung from the ceiling, controlled by electrical panels that might still function despite the creature's electromagnetic interference. The main electrical panel was mounted on the wall 20 feet from my current position, but reaching it would require exposing myself to attack from both creatures. They'd positioned themselves to cover the most direct approach, forcing me to choose between certain death by claw and possible death by electrocution. I chose electrocution. Breaking from cover, I sprinted toward the electrical panel while both creatures converged on my position. The larger one reached me first, its claws raking across my tactical vest and drawing blood through the reinforced fabric. I managed to reach the panel and threw the main lighting switch just as those massive jaws snapped shut where my head had been milliseconds before. Every fluorescent fixture in the mill erupted with brilliant white light that reflected off polished metal surfaces and turned the production floor into a blazing landscape of illumination. Both creatures recoiled with shrieks that sounded like steam escaping from damaged pipes, their massive eyes squinting shut against brightness they couldn't tolerate. But this time, I wasn't just buying time for escape. This time, I was going to end this. The creatures pressed themselves against the mill's darkest corners, seeking shadows that offered protection from the overwhelming illumination. They were trapped between their light sensitivity and their need to eliminate the threat I represented, creating confusion that disrupted their coordination. I moved toward the creature that had killed Dr. Harbour, my rifle raised but my finger hesitant on the trigger. In the blazing light, I could see details of its anatomy that had been hidden in shadow. The way its elongated limbs folded against its torso, the texture of skin that seemed to absorb illumination, the intelligence behind that massive eye that was currently squeezed shut against the fluorescent glare. It looked vulnerable, afraid. The creature sensed my approach and tried to retreat further into the corner, but the mill's walls prevented escape. It made that keening sound again, a call that seemed to be pleading for something I couldn't understand. When it opened its eye to look at me, I saw terror that was unmistakably sentient. It knew it was about to die, and it was afraid. My finger tightened on the trigger, but I hesitated. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. This was a thinking, feeling being that had formed emotional bonds with its companions and was now facing death in territory that was completely alien to everything it understood. The second creature made the decision for me. It launched itself from the shadows despite the painful illumination, moving to protect its companion even though the fluorescent lights caused it obvious distress. Those massive jaws opened as it crossed the distance between us, and I knew that if I didn't act immediately, both creatures would overwhelm my position. I turned and fired 3 rounds into the attacking creature's center mass, watching it stagger but continue its advance. The bullets weren't enough to stop it, but they bought me the seconds I needed to aim for what Dr. Harbour had identified as their one vulnerable point, that massive eye. My 4th shot punched through the creature's pupil and into whatever brain structure lay behind it. The effect was immediate and devastating. The creature's coordinated movement collapsed, its elongated limbs folding as neural control failed. It hit the mill's concrete floor with the wet finality of death, dark fluid pooling around its motionless form. The surviving creature witnessed its companion's death with that same keening call I'd heard before, but amplified to levels that made the mill's metal framework vibrate in resonance. It was a sound of loss so profound that it transcended species barriers, the cry of a being that had just watched its family member die in hostile territory. And in that moment, I understood something that would change how I viewed Anomaly Response forever. These creatures weren't monsters. They were people. Different from us in every biological sense, but people nonetheless, thinking, feeling beings capable of love and loss, and all the emotions that made existence meaningful rather than mere survival. The surviving creature looked at me with that massive eye, and I saw accusation there. Grief, understanding that I was responsible for destroying its family, but also something that looked like acceptance. It knew it was alone now in territory that offered no sanctuary, facing an enemy it couldn't defeat. It made one last attempt to reach its dead companion, crawling across the mill floor despite the painful illumination that surrounded us. When it reached the body, it pressed its elongated form against the motionless figure and made sounds that were unmistakably mourning. Soft huffing noises that seemed to be some form of final goodbye. I could have shot it then, could have ended the threat permanently while it was distracted by grief. But instead, I found myself lowering my rifle and watching a creature mourn its dead with rituals that seemed as meaningful as any human funeral. The creature looked up at me again, and this time I saw something different in its gaze. Not predatory calculation or tactical assessment, but what appeared to be gratitude that I was allowing it these final moments with its companion. Then it did something that shattered every assumption I'd made about anomalous entities. It looked directly into my eyes and slowly, deliberately, placed its elongated hands around its own throat. The creature was choosing to die rather than continue existing alone in hostile territory. It had evaluated its situation, separated from whatever environment had produced it, with no prospect of return, facing enemies it couldn't defeat, and decided that survival without its companions wasn't worth the struggle. I watched an alien being commit suicide rather than live without its family. The creature's massive eye closed as it applied pressure to its own throat, cutting off whatever biological processes sustained its existence. Its breathing became labored, then stopped entirely. The electromagnetic interference that had plagued our equipment throughout this encounter faded to nothing as the creature's neural activity ceased. Silence settled over the sock and textile mill like a burial shroud. I was alone among the bodies of 200 innocent people and 3 creatures that had never asked to be transported to our world in classified cargo containers. 3 beings that had been as lost and confused as any refugees, trying to survive in an environment they didn't understand while facing enemies they'd never encountered. The Department 47 mission had been a success. 3 anomalous entities neutralized, threat to civilian populations eliminated, containment protocols. Well, containment had never really been an option, but the creatures were dead, and that had always been the real objective. So why did I feel like I'd just committed murder? I radioed Captain Freeman with our emergency frequency, reporting mission completion and requesting immediate cleanup support. The electromagnetic interference was gone, so communications functioned normally as I coordinated the arrival of specialized teams who would sanitize the scene and ensure no evidence of anomalous activity reached public awareness. But as I waited for backup to arrive, I found myself staring at the creature that had chosen death over solitude and wondering what kind of world these beings had come from. What kind of society produced entities capable of such profound emotional bonds that they would rather die than exist without their companions? And what did it say about us that our first response to contact with intelligent life had been immediate termination orders? I submitted my after-action report 3 days later, documenting the successful neutralization of 3 hostile anomalies that had posed significant threat to civilian populations. I described their tactical capabilities, their light sensitivity, their vulnerability to targeted neural damage. Everything Department 47 needed to know for future encounters with similar entities. But I didn't mention the grief. I didn't describe the creature's suicide or the moment of recognition when 2 different forms of intelligence acknowledged each other across species barriers. I didn't report that we might have just killed the first confirmed contact with sentient alien life, because I knew what would happen to that information. It would be classified, buried, forgotten, turned into tactical data for future termination protocols, rather than foundation for understanding that consciousness and emotion might be universal constants that transcended biological differences. Instead, I requested transfer to Department 47's Research Division, citing interest in anomaly behavioral patterns and psychological assessment protocols. If we were going to encounter more entities like these, and something told me we would, then someone needed to study them as more than just threats to be eliminated. Someone needed to remember that even monsters could love their families. And someone needed to be ready for the day when we encountered anomalous entities that weren't lost refugees defending themselves in hostile territory, but deliberate explorers seeking contact with intelligence that might be capable of understanding rather than immediate violence. Because if there were more of them out there, if these 3 creatures had somehow escaped from a larger population somewhere among the stars, then our first contact protocols had just guaranteed that when they came looking for their missing family members, they wouldn't be interested in peaceful communication. They would be coming for revenge. But that was a problem for future missions. Tonight, I was just a tired agent sitting in an abandoned textile mill, surrounded by the evidence of humanity's capacity for both violence and understanding, wondering if the grief I felt for 3 dead creatures made me a better human or a worse one. I never did figure out the answer to that question, but I never stopped asking it.